The light tanks of Hell Loose are very much a mixed bag of vehicles. Either you like them or you hate them. And that's because they are lightly armed, lightly armored, but very fast and can traverse the battlefield in a short amount of time. And at Hell Loose, light tanks are kind of a mixed bag of a tank. Either people like them or people will stay completely away from them. And with the lack of armor and armament, I could see that thinking. But at the same time, the light tanks can provide a lot of use to a team, whether as a flanker or even as a frontline tank in a pinch. In this Hell Loose guide video, we're going to talk about how to play light tanks correctly. Now, first I do want to give a rundown of the light tanks, and they're very similar to recon tanks or armored recon. So, light tanks are very fast and agile, but they are very lightly armed and armored. Now, light tanks are very similar to armored recon in those regards. However, there are some slight differences. The two main ones being the armor and the mobility sake. Now, although the light tanks are very fast, they have manual transmissions and tracks. So with the transmissions, you have to cycle through gears once you get up to a higher RPM compared to automatic transmissions in game where you don't have to worry about this. And there are tracks, so you can actually go over trenches a lot easier and just traverse over certain obstacles a lot better than armored recon. The second major thing is the armor. So, although the armor isn't that impressive on a light tank, it can still take a little bit more punishment than a recon tank or armored recon. The main example I pull here is that if you're in a recon vehicle or armored recon and you take a rocket launcher shot to the hull, you'll be immediately destroyed. But in a light tank, you can take up to 2 rocket launcher hits, provided they penetrate the armor. And at certain weird angles, you can actually bounce, and depending on what rocket launcher you use, you can actually bounce off the front armor of light tanks. Now, although you do have a little bit more armor to play with, you can still be one-shot by mediums and heavies. So, although you can take a little bit more punishment, you're still not invincible, and it's important to at least know that when you are using this vehicle. But that's just a quick rundown of the light tanks as a whole. Now, there is one big thing to note with the light tanks of Hell Loose. Every faction has some slight differences to their tanks. And the main ones I want to reference here are the main gun armaments, and if your tank has a hull machine gun for the driver to use. And although I've already talked about what most of the light tanks are, I do want to break down each of the individual light tanks. Starting with the American M5A1 Stuart tank. This tank mounts a 37mm anti-tank cannon with a 30 caliber machine gun in the hull for the driver to use, and a 30 caliber machine gun in the turret itself. For the Germans, you have the Panzer II Lux light tank, mounting a 20mm autocannon and a regular MG34 in the turret with no hull machine gun to be used. So the Panzer II Lux does excel at one thing, and it's to kill enemy infantry and light vehicles alike. The 20mm autocannon is perfect for this, and coupled with the machine gun, it is a terror against infantry and light vehicle threats, such as against armored recons, trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, and just every little light vehicle in the game. However, its one drawback is that it can't deal with anything higher than a light tank and actually do damage to a target, such as medium tanks and heavy tanks, which all the other light tanks can do besides this one. And although with the light tank here, with the Panzer II Lux, you can destroy tank tracks on mediums and heavies, all that's really going to do is piss off the enemy tankers and potentially have them laugh at you if you're trying to engage their tank frontally or in just any fashion. Again, nice distraction tactic, but you're going to most likely get destroyed if you go head-to-head with a medium or heavy, since you can't actually damage them in this vehicle, unfortunately. Moving on from that, the light tank you'll use for the Soviets is the T-70 light tank, armed with a 45mm anti-tank cannon and a 7.62mm machine gun in the turret. The driver does not have a hull machine gun. Moving on from that, we have the British faction, and depending on what map you're on, you will actually have 2 different light tanks. So if you're on the map Driel, you'll actually be driving the Tetrach light tank, a light tank armed with a 45mm anti-tank cannon and a 7.92 Beza machine gun in the turret. The driver does not have a hull machine gun to use. And if you find yourself on an Alamein, you'll be using the American Lend-Leased M3A1 Stuart, which is essentially exactly like the M5 Stuart, just a older version of it, with a 30 caliber hull machine gun for the driver, a coaxial 30 caliber for the turret, and a 37mm anti-tank cannon. Now, I also wanted to display the amount of shots it'll take to destroy certain vehicles from certain positions. So with the Puma, the Panzer II, Panzer IV, Panther, and Tiger, they're all outlined on screen there for where you need to hit it. I just want to keep the video going and keep it a little bit simplistic. And then here are the numbers for the German light tank Deluxe. As you can see, there are a couple differences here. Can't even destroy the mediums and heavies, while the other light tanks can with a certain number of shots, being mostly 3 shots to the back, which is funny because some of the armament is actually the same on the recon vehicles, but it actually takes more shots to destroy using a recon vehicle's armament than a light tank's armament, which, for whatever reason, I can't explain that. That's just the game's balancing. Now, light tanks and how they should be used in Held Loose is very similar to how armored recon should be used. With the vehicles being very fast but very lightly armed and armored, you really can't go toe-to-toe with enemy armor threats. So your main course of action should be to flank around any armor threats or concentrations of infantry and tanks and flank them out. The main things you should really be hunting with the light tanks are garrisons and trucks and half-tracks. But if you have to tango with enemy armor, it's important to try to figure out where they're at before you engage them. And once you have true sight lines on them, actually move around to flank the enemy, taking at least extreme care to move behind cover to lessen your exposure to, say, if the enemy has a 3-man tank crew. In this example here, I was able to get behind an enemy Panzer IV, spotted by a recon team, and even as a 2-man, I was able to find the backside of the tank and destroy it effectively. Now, light tanks as a whole are not completely useless on the front line either. They're just more suited for behind the lines, flanking, and hit-and-run attacks. But you do have enough armor to at least sustain yourself against at least one rocket before you can be destroyed. Meaning that you could take one rocket hit and continue going before you can be destroyed. Meaning you can take 2 rocket hits before destruction. And you can do this to maybe take on infantry threats at a defense point, or at least deal with a clump of infantry, or again, light armor. But if you're operating in the front lines, you're most likely going to run into enemy tanks such as mediums and heavies, and the light tank just cannot face those armor threats. So if you are going to help out in the front line, don't make your presence longer than it has to be. Do what you need to do and move out. And if you can't get out, do your best to eliminate any and all threats to just your team and kill as much infantry and spawn points as possible. So to simplify everything, the light tanks are great to move around and drive around, get behind the enemy and flank them out and do hit and run attacks. But if you have to do some frontline action, you can do that too. Just know that you're not going to be as effective if you were actually getting behind the enemy and attacking the enemy spawn points and catching, hopefully, enemy tanks off guard. Main things to note though is you have a manual transmission, so you do have to cycle through the gears, but other than that, you can play these tanks very similarly to recon vehicles. I know I've referenced it a lot throughout this video, but it's important. Also, light tanks like to have some weird physics like you just saw in this clip, but hope you got something from the video. It's pretty cut and dry with light tanks in my opinion, but hope you got something from the video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.